Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this Forum for Philosophy event on Moritz Schlick. The Vienna Circle is one of the most recognizable brands in the history of philosophy, and some of the figures on the margins of that circle, like Ludwig Wittgenstein, 𝗘𝗱𝗺𝗆, Frank Ramsey, are some of the biggest names in 20th century philosophy. And yet the person right at the middle of the Vienna Circle, its informal leader, Moritz Schlick, is much less well known. So we thought it would be appropriate to choose Schlick as the focal point for this event. We'll talk about Schlick's own life and work, but we'll also then broaden out to think about the circle of which he was a part and the broader legacy of that circle on the rest of philosophy. And it's fantastic to be joined by three top experts who are the best people to talk about this chapter in the history of philosophy. They are David Edmonds, author of a wonderful recent book on the Vienna Circle; Cheryl Misak, author of a wonderful recent biography of Frank Ramsey; and Carla Galavotti, author of a wonderful book on the Vienna Circle and Frank Ramsey. To give you a sense of the format for this event, we'll talk among the panel about Schlick's life and work and milieu, and about the legacy of the Vienna Circle. And then towards the end, we'll take your questions as well. And it would be fantastic to hear your questions at any point during the event via the Q&A box in the Zoom webinar platform. Please feel free to type your question at any time, but we'll get to them towards the end. So let's start with you, David. You recently published this book, The Murder of Professor Schlick. Now, biographers like you have to be very selective about their subjects. Now, these people have to be worth dedicating years of your life to. Why did you choose Schlick as the person to dedicate all this time to?
Well, I wanted to tell the story of the Vienna Circle. I've been interested in the circle for the last 20 years, I guess, ever since co-writing Wittgenstein's poker about Wittgenstein and Popper and a famous row they had in Cambridge, which was extremely fierce. And we came to the conclusion that part of the explanation for why it was so fierce was Vienna. And so we became very interested in the circle then, and in particular, both Wittgenstein's and Popper's relationship to the circle. So I wanted to tell the story of the circle. It's a difficult sell from the outside. It looks like a difficult sell. Here are a bunch of rather abstract technical philosophers. But the truth is, there is a very good story at the heart of it. There's a murder, and Schlick meets a very nasty end in 1936. And so that gave me a narrative hook to tell the story. But he's actually much more interesting than people give him credit for. You know, he's a fascinating figure, a very, very important figure. He's important partly for what he's not, actually. He's not Austrian, like most of the Vienna Circle. He's not Jewish, like many of the Vienna Circle. And he's not a socialist, like all the members of the Vienna Circle. But he's very important to them. He was, as you said, he was the informal head of it. He was very important for his role in bringing Wittgenstein into the circle. He was very important because he was basically a physicist, and he was very interested in Einsteinian physics and had a close relationship with Einstein. So for all those reasons, he's very important and interesting.
So what happened to him? The focal point of your book is Schlick's death. Tell us what happened.
Well, he leaves his rather posh apartment. He's quite a wealthy man in Vienna to take the tram down to the lecture hall at the University of Vienna. He leaves at about 8 o'clock. The lecture is at about 9:15. He arrives at the university, and there waiting for him is a former student called Hans Nilbuck, who is a schizophrenic, really, and has been stalking Schlick for years. And Schlick has had bodyguards because he's been so worried about this person. 𝗘𝗱𝗺que has been institutionalized a couple of times. And Schlick can't get everybody to take it as seriously as he thinks they ought. And 𝗘𝗱𝗺que is there waiting for him with a gun, shoots him 4 times, shouting, now you damn bastard, there you have it. And he's literally left holding a smoking gun when the police arrive.
Wow, so your book tells the story of, before and after, the events that led up to that and its consequences. I mean, I suppose let's go back to the beginning then. I mean, what was the Vienna Circle? What was Schlick's role in bringing it all together?
Well, Schlick arrives in Vienna in 1922. Hahn, another member of the Circle, is instrumental in bringing him to Vienna, and Hahn has got empiricist instincts and wants an ally. And then in 1924, an informal group begins to meet. They first meet in coffee houses, and then it's formalized and they meet at the university. And Schlick is the leader. Schlick basically decides who's invited, who's not invited. That becomes important later because Popper would love to be a member of the Vienna Circle, and Schlick excludes him. And they begin each meeting by reading through some letters they might have got from all sorts of people like Bertrand Russell and others. And then they have a discussion, which might be about probability, might be about induction, might be about verification. And this goes on all the way, basically, till 1934, when the fascists arrive. And then it stumbles on until Schlick's murder. And then Weissmann, Friedrich Weissmann, who's another member of the Circle, tries to keep it going until the Anschluss, by which stage they pretty much all fled.
So was Schlick targeted because of his role in the Vienna Circle? It sounds like from your version of events, it really wasn't that.
Well, he probably wasn't. He was probably targeted because his murderer suspected that he was having an affair with a young female student who 𝗘𝗱𝗺que himself had his eyes on. So it was probably very personal. But afterwards, 𝗘𝗱𝗺que claimed it was a political assassination. And what's most interesting about the murder is how the newspapers cover it. So some of the newspapers are quite sympathetic, but 2 or 3 of the newspapers describe it as a justified murder, that logical positivism was Jewish philosophy, and they then agitate after 𝗘𝗱𝗺que is found guilty, and there was no other possible verdict, given that he was caught red-handed. They agitate to have him released, which indeed he is quite early, shortly after World War II begins. So it was a murder that was probably committed for very personal reasons, but then it was interpreted as a political killing. Some of the newspapers described Schlick as a Jewish philosopher, which he wasn't, but they condemned logical positivism for being a subversive philosophy, and so justify 𝗘𝗱𝗺que's action.
So your version of events is one on which Schlick is not actually targeted for anti-Semitic reasons, but then the press pounce on this and offer anti-Semitic justifications for why he was targeted.
Yeah, not just anti-Semitic justifications. They loathe logical empiricism for various reasons. I mentioned that most of the members were socialists, but really they loathed it because logical empiricism was anti-metaphysics, and the fascists and the Nazis were pro-metaphysics. Logical empiricism was anti-romanticism. Logical empiricism was anti-ideas such as the folk, the idea that there was a group of people, the German people, who was something over and above the set of individuals that made up Germany. So logical empiricism was anti-religion, anti-theology of all kinds. There were lots of reasons why a Catholic Austria and a fascist and a German Nazi party would have to dislike the logical empiricists.
So even though, as far as I know, Nazism itself was sort of anti-religious in a sense, the fact that the logical positivists were strongly anti-spiritual, anti-metaphysics set them in opposition to Nazism.
Yes, but Austria was a very Catholic country, of course. So the fact that the logical empirical movement was a secular movement meant that it was not fertile ground in Austria generally. In Vienna was a completely sort of different case and was sui generis. I mean, Vienna was surrounded by these very conservative Catholic hinterlands, and Vienna had been through a socialist period, and there was, a big liberal intelligentsia, there was a socialist movement. But beyond Vienna, logical empiricism was, insofar as it was known at all, was a movement that was not at all conducive to the Austrian population.
I'd like to bring Cheryl in on this, I think. Cheryl, what do you think united the Vienna Circle intellectually?
I think what united them was an idea that wasn't local to Vienna or to Berlin. I think it was an idea whose time had come, because you see manifestations of it in England and in America at around the same time. So the Vienna Circle, just in a nutshell, had a view that every meaningful statement you could utter or write had to be verifiable by observation. It had to be scientific. And here's where you get the anti-religion, anti-metaphysics, indeed kind of anti-philosophy, right? Because philosophy tends to be abstract and not something that you could nail down to the physical world. And one saw Russell, especially in England, in the 1915-ish, having this kind of thought. He called his position logical atomism. One found the idea in American pragmatism, from the late 1800s. And then lo and behold, you also find it cropping up completely independently in Vienna. The early Wittgenstein had it. So this big idea that all meaningful thought and expression should be about the world and verifiable was the unifying theme.
And that philosophy is then recast, I suppose, as a discipline that is about the logical analysis of language and mathematics to try and break these complex structures down into their individually verifiable components.
Yes, so on the most, this was the aim of all of these movements, was to have philosophy be logical, mathematical, technical, scientific. But they all had a problem with what to do with those very arguments that they had made about this is how philosophy should be. It should be scientific, because all of those arguments were, that was all philosophy. So Wittgenstein famously said in his 1922 Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, which presented this locked down scientific picture of the world, that once you use his philosophical propositions to find out that philosophy was nonsense, then you use those propositions like a ladder. You climbed up on the ladder and then you kicked the ladder out from under you, never to utter another word of philosophy again. So that's one approach.
It's a great metaphor, isn't it? Yeah,
it's a great metaphor. But they all had certainly the Vienna Circle, Wittgenstein, they had a problem with telling us, just how they managed to utter all these philosophical statements to get to their position about philosophy, but also they had a problem with ethics, and a lot of science turned out not to be verifiable. They had a lot of problems.
Yes, but I love that idea of, an ambitious unifying program for philosophy Of course, no such program has ever really worked, but it's one of the great visions of what the discipline can be about. I'd like to also bring in Maria Carla on this question of what you think united the Vienna Circle intellectually and what set them apart.
Well, certainly the analytical approach that was already mentioned, the idea that all knowledge, and in particular scientific knowledge, would have to be rooted in experience. So the empirical approach, and also this the program of the unity of science that you just mentioned, that gave rise to a big program, namely the project of the Encyclopedia of the Unified Science, that went on until the 60s, and which I think included at least two different components. Namely, they thought that the unity of science would be realized on the level of language, namely that there could be a common language for all scientific disciplines, and also as regards methodology. So they believed in to be able to describe to a scientific what scientific method is, what an effective and useful methodology for science is, and this could be a unifying trace for all scientific disciplines. Now, of these two components, I believe that the first one is completely obsolete. The second one is half.
Which one is completely obsolete, sorry?
The idea of being able to specify a unified language for all scientific disciplines. The methodological part is maybe half obsolete. But maybe we can come back to this.
Yes, but we'll come back to how we should think about these ideas today. Certainly, whatever you think of them, you have to love the boldness, the boldness of this idea of systematizing all human knowledge in a common language. I mean, in which every sentence is verifiable. It'd be wonderful if it were possible. But David, I want to come back to you. You mentioned you said not quite all of them were socialists, and in fact, Schlick was an exception. How do you think their politics interacted with these grand intellectual aims?
Well, there's an important aspect to Schlick's biography here. In 1929, Schlick is offered a job in Bonn in Germany, and he's very seriously considering it. And members of the circle ask him to reconsider, and he does. And he decides to stay in Vienna. He thinks that the circle has unfinished business. And to thank him, the circle comes up with what they call a manifesto of what the Vienna Circle stands for. And it's a bit like being given a gift for Christmas. They hand it to Schlick, and he really doesn't like it at all. And one of the things, to come back to your question, that he doesn't like about it, there are a couple of things he doesn't like about it. The first thing is, it is not modest, okay? It's incredibly ambitious and bold in its claims and allows of no doubt. And Schlick is a modest man, and he doesn't like the terms in which the manifesto is expressed. But the second aspect that he really doesn't like about the manifesto is that it's quite political, that it ties up the circle's ambition, which has been described by Cheryl and Maria Carla, to prescribe what the nature of philosophy is and to call everything that isn't analytic basically nonsense unless it can be verified. He describes, they describe their project in political terms, and they think that they can use this empirical element of the circle's thinking to improve society. And the key person here is Otto Neurath, who's also Schlick's key opponent in the circle. So the main tension in the circle is between Schlick and Otto Neurath. Neurath is half a Marxist and half a Benthamite, if you can believe that. He's a Marximite or something. And he thinks that that society should be remodeled basically on utilitarian terms, and that you can use the empirical sciences and you can use the skills of the technocratic class to build better houses, to make people more literate and so on. Schlick really doesn't like that political program. Schlick wants to remain out of politics. As you mentioned, Schlick is a conservative with a small c. He's certainly not a Marxist or a utilitarian Marxist. So he is very much opposed to this political project, which some of the others think is part and parcel of what logical empiricism is all about.
So Neurath is the great sort of champion of the idea that the Vienna Circle should have a political mission.
Correct.
And Schlick says, no, that's not what we're about. I mean, what happens after Schlick's death then? I mean, does Neurath win? Well,
Neurath has already had to escape. He's so political that he basically has to escape in 1934. He is both Jewish and a Marxist. And when the fascists arrive, being a Jewish Marxist is not a good combination of attributes to possess. So he escapes very quickly. He goes to Holland, and then he escapes from Holland when the Nazis invade Holland by the skin of his teeth, and he arrives in Britain in 1940. So
there's something in the book about he literally travels on a raft or a boat or something.
Correct. And he waits till the Nazis invade, and he goes down to the dock. He's in the Hague, I think, and he basically jumps on a small boat and comes across to the UK. But when the Austro-fascists take over, so there's a two-stage process in Austria. The Austro-fascists take over in 1934, and then the Nazis move in 1938. So you've got this period when it's Austro-fascist, not Nazi, and the Austro-fascists and the Nazis are not allies. In fact, the Austro-fascists want to keep the Nazis out. But there's a period when the Austro-fascists are in charge, and well, maybe we're getting ahead of ourselves, but they close down the circle, and they say the circle is political. And Schlick tries to argue with them and says, no, we're nothing to do with politics. We're purely a philosophical meeting group. And it may be the case that a few individuals like Neurath are political, but that is nothing to do with the logical empirical movement.
So in that milieu of 1930s Vienna, it's a defense strategy to be able to say this is a purely intellectual group. We don't do politics.
Yes, a failed defense strategy. It didn't work. And it wasn't merely a strategy because, as I say, in Schlick's case, he genuinely was a conservative with a small c. So it was not merely a strategy, but because of the publication of the manifesto, there was sort of documentary evidence that this was, in fact, a political movement.
And in fact, most of them were progressives and part of Red Vienna. So Schlick was an outlier. I'm not sure about Hans Hahn, but Carnap for sure was on the left, and they were excited about the reforms being made in between the wars in Vienna in terms of workers' rights and housing and workers' education. So Schlick was a little bit of an outlier, although one must say that uniformly, people say he was a wonderful man. So Ramsey, for instance, thought he was very, well, Ramsey says of Schlick, he wasn't a very good philosopher, but he was a very nice man. And
harsh judgment. He was clearly a very modest man, and he had diplomatic skills. So he was the perfect person to control a bunch of often quite powerful egos. And Neurath is one of those powerful egos. We haven't begun to talk about Wittgenstein yet. So Wittgenstein doesn't come into the circle per se, but Wittgenstein is on an outer ring of the circle, and it is Schlick with, as Cheryl will tell you, with Ramsey's advice, who brings the ideas of Wittgenstein into the circle, but it's Schlick who meets with Wittgenstein and becomes the principal translator of Wittgenstein to the circle.
It's an important contribution, isn't it, Cheryl?
Yeah, so Wittgenstein was already on Schlick's radar in 1922, 23, perhaps. So Carnap went to America in 1923, I believe, to meet with some mathematicians. And he got wind in America that there was a group of mathematically inclined philosophers in the UK, and the list was quite long. Russell was on it, Keynes was on it, Wittgenstein was on it. No, Wittgenstein wasn't singled out in any way, but Carnap wrote to Reichenbach, and then before you know it, they were all writing to each other. There's this group of people in the UK who are doing the same kind of thing we are. And Schlick eventually made contact with Wittgenstein, who was living in Austria at the time and had just published the Tractatus. And they really hit it off. They loved each other. They went on a 2-week kind of walking holiday in Italy together. And I think Wittgenstein, he wasn't into group work at all. And I think one of the main reasons that Wittgenstein was so really enmeshed in the Vienna Circle was because he really loved Schlick. But Wittgenstein was at many, many meetings of the circle right through, so starting in about 1927, right through to 1934. He was, he grumped about some of the members of the circle. He thought that they were plagiarizing his ideas. Twice he said Carnap was plagiarizing his ideas, but that actually just shows you how close they were, right? How close their ideas were. Wittgenstein, they were plagiarizing him.
So, but Wittgenstein had this effect on Schlick that he did to so many people. Schlick was in total awe of Wittgenstein, and when he first goes to see him, his wife said it was as if he were preparing to go on a holy pilgrimage. And I mentioned he becomes the chief translator of Wittgenstein, but there are also examples of Schlick having ideas, which are probably original ideas, which he actually gives to Wittgenstein. You know, he comes to believe he's incapable of original ideas, and all the brilliant stuff originates in Wittgenstein. So, and Cheryl said, yeah, he went to many groups, many meetings, but never once to the official circle. So he was never invited into the university itself. They would meet in various places, and famously, you know, sometimes Wittgenstein just refused to talk philosophy to them, and he would turn his back and read poetry to them, and they would just have to suffer in silence.
It sounds awful.
Dave, was it that Wittgenstein wasn't invited to the official meetings, or did he insist that he met only in these more informal settings so that no one could say of him that he was a part of the Vienna Circle?
It was definitely the latter. It was definitely the latter. So Schlick would have loved to have him come along, and he refused to go. And initially, Carnap and Feigl would join Schlick, and then Carnap and Wittgenstein didn't get along. Wittgenstein accused Carnap of having no nose for philosophy. And so eventually Carnap was basically dropped, and Wittgenstein would meet with Schlick and Feigl, but Schlick remains the key conduit for Wittgenstein to the circle.
Just thinking about this. Yes, Maria Carla, go on.
I would like to ask, to add something about the political involvement of these people and the political nature of the philosophy of the logical empiricism. I think there is I think that when Neurath, by way of self-defense, said that logical empiricism was not a political movement, he uttered a half-truth, actually, because it is certainly true, it's historical, that all of those people, with the exception of Schlick, were involved in socio-political movements like the free thinkers, just to mention one, and were pursuing progressive objectives of various kinds, like above all, the innovation of school. They wanted to have a more comprehensive school system, and they were extremely involved in this project. And they were pursuing other innovative ideas, but this was on a personal reason. On the other hand, it is true that the scientific world conception, as it is contained in the manifesto, was meant to have a social impact, in the sense that this work of clarification of concepts and of making them a matter of communication among different people, was meant to help people to be able to, for example, to decide what can be trusted and what cannot be trusted, things like that. But on the other hand, members of the Vienna Circle never thought that ethical and political issues could be matter for philosophy. So they were out of philosophy, these topics. And after the immigration, after philosophy of science moved away of Europe, especially to the US, thing became radicalized. There is a very nice book by Reich that is called How the Cold War Transformed Philosophy of Science, that describes this process in detail very, very well, namely that they were completely distanced from ethical and political issues at that point, and for a long time.
Yeah, and reflecting on this question of what is it to make a philosophical contribution, which is quite an abstract question, but there was obviously this cult of genius worship at this time, where Wittgenstein is worshipped to an absolutely absurd degree. And I think Ramsey is also quite worshipped. And there's this sense that unless you're this sort of young male aloof genius, you can't contribute anything. But what Schlick was doing was making important contributions, was it not? I mean, if you knock heads together, if you organize groups like this, if you're a good collaborator, if you're bouncing ideas off other people, Schlick was doing the kind of thing that we should, in fact, recognize as a contribution. Do you think, Cheryl?
Yeah, I'd like to quibble with just part of what you said. So the cult of genius really was about Wittgenstein, right? So the circle, the Vienna Circle, the Berlin Circle, Ramsey, these people all thought that the way you make progress is to get together, discuss, debate, move forward, build on what previous people have done. So, Ramsey, so the circles, obviously, that was their whole reason for being. Ramsey was, one-man interdisciplinary department. He worked in economics, in mathematics, in philosophy, probability theory, all with other people. It really was Wittgenstein who had this idea that philosophy comes from you as an individual, and actually it's a little bit unseemly if you build on the work of someone else. And this is why he never acknowledged, or not never, but he rarely acknowledged the contributions that other people had made to his thought, and that encouraged the cult of genius.
It's an irony, isn't it, that you have this movement aimed at making philosophy more scientific, which should mean more collaborative, more about teamwork, etc. And then in the middle of it, you've got this character, Wittgenstein, who is the antithesis of all of that.
Yeah, but it was only Wittgenstein.
Yes, I shouldn't group Ramsey with Wittgenstein in that respect.
And it was doubly ironic because they were not unaware that there was this cult of genius around in the atmosphere. And for the Nazis, the cult of genius was quite a romantic idea. And some of the circle actually write about the cult of genius. Edgar Zilsel is one such, and critiques it. And the idea that there's this special breed of human beings, completely distinct from all other human beings with these special characteristics, that's critiqued by one or two members of the circle. So it is ironic that, in fact, Wittgenstein was then clearly held up as an exemplar of this, of a type of genius.
They were in the grip of something they could themselves critique in other people. Cheryl? Yeah.
So not everyone in the Vienna and Berlin circles thought that Wittgenstein was so wonderful. Carnap, for instance, was quite skeptical about him as a person and his abilities. Ramsey was the person closest to Wittgenstein, but really thought that his great work at the time, the Tractatus, was deeply flawed, and spent the last year of his life hammering away at it and really making Wittgenstein give it up. So it wasn't that everyone was taken by him, but Schlick was, I think, and Weissman. I'm sure there are others.
So Maria Carla, tell us about the Berlin Circle, which has been mentioned. This other circle over in Berlin interacting with the Vienna Circle. How did that work?
Well, the Berlin Society, it was called the Berlin Society for Empirical Philosophy. That was a kind of twin group, sharing the basic tenets, the Vienna group, what we already mentioned. But not all of them. In particular, Hans Reichenbach was very critical of the approach that was dominant in Vienna. He was especially critical of the theory of meaning, based on the criterion of verification, and was not only critical of the principle of verifiability, but also of the weaker idea of partial definitions that was put forward by Carla later around 46, if I'm not 36, sorry. Testability meaning. Why was he so critical about that? Because he thought that they completely overlooked the notion of probability. He used to say that the theory of knowledge is a theory of prediction, but since predictions about the future are uncertain, they are not certain, they cannot be said to be true. In fact, he used also to say that truth is a phantom, an unrealizable phantom. So what do we need? We need probability. And he developed a whole epistemology that is based on probability.
Right, and
sorry.
Cheryl, I wanted to ask about Ramsey. So we talk about biographers needing to choose their subjects carefully, and Ramsey is the one for you that you've dedicated years of your life to. How did the Vienna Circle enter into Frank Ramsey's life?
Ramsey translated the Tractatus, and so he was immediately on the radar of the Vienna Circle. And so that was 1922, the Tractatus was published. 1923, Ramsey wrote a really important critical notice of it. And he actually was, in 1924, in Vienna to be psychoanalyzed along with many, many of his compatriots by either Freud or Freud students. And in 1924, when he spent this 6 months in Vienna, he met Schlick, actually at Wittgenstein's sister's very elaborate fancy house at a dinner party. He met Hans Hahn, and immediately they had much to talk about because they were all very mathematically inclined philosophers. And at the time, Ramsey was finishing his undergraduate thesis, which was trying to repair a hole in Russell and Whitehead's Principia Mathematica. And the Circle at that time was very, very engaged with Russell's work. So there was a personal and intellectual connection right off the bat. And as I say, Ramsey really liked Schlick, invited him in 1927 to come to Cambridge and give a talk at the Moral Sciences Club. But Ramsey was deeply skeptical of the project of finding a common language for all of knowledge and for reducing it really to, experience or certainty. So as Carla was saying, Reichenbach focused on probability. The same holds for Ramsey. He focused on partial belief, not the kind of full belief that this locked in theory of knowledge that Wittgenstein and the Vienna Circle were presenting.
So the Berlin Circle and Ramsey have in common this feeling that the Vienna Circle neglects probability, and that we need to be talking not about verifying statements as such, but assigning probabilities to
yes,
them.
But they had different ideas of what probability, how probability should be conceived, because
right,
because Reichenbach brought a frequency view of probability, while Ramsey was a subjectivist. But they had something in common, namely they were both Bayesians.
That disagreement over what probability is, it persists to this day, doesn't it, really? I mean, even now you have people who think of probability as a subjective phenomenon in the tradition of Ramsey, and those who think it's all about relative frequencies over the long run in the tradition of Reichenbach.
Well, I think that, you are right to say that now subjectivism is more popular than the frequency view, but the frequency theory of probability is not dead at all. It is still very, very important, and it is still I think probably the dominant theory or the dominant interpretations among physicists, among genetists, among those people who study mass phenomena.
Mm-hmm.
But probably, let me add that if we are talking about the frequency theory of probability, now the more popular or the more the version of it that that gains more consensus is certainly not Reichenbach's, but Richard von Mises, who was also a member of the Berlin Circle, by the way.
Cheryl?
And it should also be said that, Ramsey was really clear that the frequency theory of probability was probably the most appropriate, i.e. right theory of probability for physics and for some other sciences. It's just that when you are thinking about how to measure partial human belief and our uncertainty, then you had to move to a subjectivist account of probability. But now we're getting into some very deep weeds in probability.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, David, let's get out of the weeds and talk about Popper. You mentioned Popper as another subject that fascinates you, and another one of these characters on the edge of the Vienna Circle. Was he a friend or an enemy?
He was an enemy, but not as much as of an enemy as he would like everyone to believe. So basically, the things that interested Popper interested the circle. So he called himself the official opposition to the circle. He would have loved to have been a member of the circle, but in one talk, he was extremely rude about Wittgenstein. And Schlick never forgave him, and so the invitation never arrived. The invitation to come to the circle was Schlick's to give and Schlick's to withhold. And so Popper never became a member of the circle, but he was fascinated by all the things that the circle was interested in, and some of the areas that Maria, Carla, and Cheryl have been talking about. He was interested in probability and induction and so on. He claimed that the distinction that most intrigued him was not the distinction that intrigued the circle, that between what was meaningful and what was meaningless, with the circle condemning as meaningless anything that was not verifiable or analytically true. Popper said that was a trivial issue. What interested him was the difference between science and not science. What should count as science and what shouldn't count as science? And it's here that he comes up with his famous falsifiability principle, that something is only scientific if it's capable of being falsified. So it's different from being verified. So the statement, all swans are white, however many white swans you see, you can never prove that all swans are white because there might be a black swan in the next pond just around the corner. But what you can prove, if you see one black swan, is that not all swans are white. So it's falsifiable, it's not verifiable. And that was his demarcation. And then the question was how you applied that. We've talked about psychoanalysis. The circle discussed psychoanalysis quite a lot because obviously Vienna was the home of Freud. It was where if you wanted to be psychoanalyzed, Vienna was where you went. It would be crazy to go to Vienna and not sample, being psychoanalyzed. So Ramsey was one of the people who got psychoanalyzed, but many others did too in Vienna, from people from outside town. But an issue for the circle was, did psychoanalysis count as a science? And that was something they argued about. Schlick was very favorable towards psychoanalysis, but others were more skeptical that it was in fact scientific.
I love that idea of going to Vienna for the psychoanalysis and staying around for debate about whether psychoanalysis is scientific or not. So please keep your questions coming in the Q&A box if you have any, and we'll turn to them in a moment. But Dave, I wanted to ask you about the later parts of your book, essentially why the Vienna Circle fell apart and what happened to them. We've talked about Schlick, who was murdered, and about Neurath, who fled in a boat. Why did the circle dissolve?
Well, it was closed down. So the Austro-fascists take over in 1934. The Ernst Mach Society, which is the public face of the Vienna Circle, which is a society in which there are lectures, adult education lectures, many given by circle members, that's closed down. It becomes very difficult to meet. It stumbles on for a couple of years till Schlick's murder. Schlick's murder, as you would expect, really concentrates minds. And at that time, people, almost all the circle, decide that now might be the time to leave. One or two of them have already gone. Feigl, for example, is one of the first to leave. Feigl leaves in 1931, but others now plots their escape.
Where do they go?
They go primarily to the US and the UK. Most to the US, but some to the UK. Popper escapes via the UK and ends up in New Zealand, where he spends the war years, and he writes his famous book, The Open Society and Its Enemies, in New Zealand. He describes it as his war effort. But the rest of them go to the US and UK. They don't all go to, you might expect they all go to Harvard and Yale, but some of them go to less prestigious universities. And actually, I think those universities can't quite believe that, as it were, they can pick these fantastic academics and add them to their faculty. But the UK, Weissman, who's an important member of the circle, Friedrich Weissman, who's sort of dominated by Wittgenstein, he comes to the UK. An interesting woman called Rose Rand comes to the UK. Neurath comes, but then dies pretty much after, as soon as the war is ended. Popper ends up in the UK after New Zealand, but most of the rest of them go to the US.
And they completely change, that's wrong. It's not that they completely changed the character of philosophy in the United States, but they meld with the homegrown American pragmatists, and together these two movements really determine the shape of analytic philosophy until now. And so the immigration was massively important for the state of philosophy in, let's just call it Anglo-American philosophy, but also it was a disaster for Germany and Austria. So I sometimes say that, Germany and Austria lost more than the war. They literally lost their brains because everyone left who could leave. Some people were murdered, not like Schlick, but in concentration camps. And I think Germany and Austria are still recovering from that these many decades later.
Yeah. So of the circle, Victor Kraft is the one of only two who is able to stay in Austria during the war years. And then Schlick's Murderer, Nell book, is released in, I think, 1940. And the rest of the circle have gone. They were not just logical empiricists, but as we've explained, most of them were socialist. Over half of them were Jewish. Even the ones who didn't consider themselves Jewish, like Popper, found that, in fact, in the eyes of the Nazis, they were. And so they all had to go out. The least political one of all of them was Gödel, who seems to be sort of strangely, we haven't even discussed Kurt Gödel, but the greatest logician of the 20th century, was a member of the circle. And he eventually leaves in 1940, but he's not Jewish, he's not very political. He possibly, could have stayed, and he seemed extraordinarily oblivious to what's going on. He said to one of the Jewish members of the circle who he bumped into in America shortly after war began, he said, "What brings you to America?" he said to the professor. But Gödel gets out as well and goes to the Institute of Advanced Study, where he becomes very friendly with Einstein, and they walk to the institute together every day for many years.
And you mentioned also Rose Rand there. It's very easy to think of the Vienna Circle as entirely a group of men. What were the contributions of women to the circle?
Well, Rose Rand, rather unfortunately, acted as secretary for some of the time. And so we have some of the minutes of the circle, which Rose Rand made. There were several female members of the circle who often get, forgotten about, and they shouldn't. I mean, it was interesting that how many members there were. And University of Vienna had lots of, not lots, but there were female undergraduates, and there were at least 4 female members of the circle. They had quite similar backgrounds. That I think they were, all 4 of them were sort of Jewish, bourgeois, secular backgrounds, of the kind of background where the parents encouraged the girls to have a good education. And Rose Rand was probably the most prominent of them. She had a very tragic life, didn't really find an academic home, and was constantly kind of short of money. And actually, there's an interesting story, which is Wittgenstein gives her money without letting her know, uses a refugee organization in the UK to pass her some money. But she has a desperately sad life and never receives the due that she deserves, really.
One might also say that the Vienna and Berlin Circle members who went to the UK, on the whole, did not thrive the way those who went to America thrived. So Weizmann also, he was never fully appreciated. I think even Neurath was never fully appreciated. Whereas, as Dave says, in America, there was a kind of organized campaign to get these people into universities. Sometimes it was University of Minnesota or the University of Illinois, but they thrived there, and they rose quickly to the top of the profession. Now you might say, well, maybe philosophers in America weren't as good as philosophers in England, but you might also say that there was some. Yeah, you might also say that the Brits were a little bit, looked down their nose a bit at them.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair to Britain, the one reason why Weizmann didn't thrive at all is because he found himself bullied by Wittgenstein.
Yes.
And he arrives in Cambridge, and Wittgenstein refuses to teach the same subjects that Weizmann is teaching. And Weizmann has to basically flee to Oxford. Neurath is a different case. He dies in 46, I think. So he barely has a post-World War II academic career. Rose Rand definitely struggles. And the one exception to this is Karl Popper. Apart from Wittgenstein, who's a very established figure and stays in the UK, but Karl Popper, he doesn't get the Oxbridge chair that he so coveted, but nonetheless, he becomes Sir Karl Popper. He becomes an establishment figure, highly respected in the UK. So he is the one figure from the circle who does climb the academic greasy pole successfully.
Maria Carla, what do you think the Vienna Circle's long-term legacy has been for philosophy of science as it is now?
Well, this is a very difficult question in the first place, because actually logical empiricism has been a very complex and diversified, articulated movement, much more than we had been thinking for a long time after, for instance, Ayer's book or other versions of logical empiricism. So many features of today's philosophy of science can actually be seen as being present, although in an embryonic stage in one or the other of the members of the Vienna Circle. But anyway, I think that today's philosophy of science is the product of two different tendencies that developed in the 60s. One is the well-known approach that was developed by Kuhn, Lakatos, Feyerabend, and so on, which is often called post-positivism, which promoted a more historical approach, to put it very simply. And the other tendency, which is often not mentioned, is a tendency that developed also in the 60s and whose main proponent was Patrick Suppis, whose approach moved towards a more pluralistic philosophy of science, a different way of looking at scientific theories that superseded completely the view of theories as nets floating on the plane of observation that had been coined by Carl Gustav Hempel, and also superseded the distinction between a context of discovery and a context of justification, opening philosophy of science to all that regards experimentation and observation. And so also opening philosophy of science also to all a bunch of statistical methodologies that are used for the formation of empirical data. I think that philosophy of science today is more pluralistic and also puts at the center probability. So in that respect, I think that the Berlin Circle survived in a way better than the Vienna Circle.
So you're putting in a bid for the Berlin Circle there. Okay, so we've got 12 minutes and 10 questions. So let's see if we can give concise answers to some of these questions. It's a good one for Cheryl here. It'd be interesting to know more about the merging or encounter between the Vienna Circle's migrants and the pragmatists in the US as contributing to analytic philosophy's development. You've written so much about both, so tell us how those groups interacted.
But first, there was real interaction between Dewey, who was at the time the top, American philosopher. He was kind of like, America's Wittgenstein, and Neurath especially. So Neurath went to New York and tried to persuade Dewey that really, he should be part of the unified movement, the unified science movement. And in fact, Dewey wrote one of the volumes in the Encyclopedia of Unified Science on theory of value. And for a while, Dewey thought, we're all empiricists, we're interested in the practical. But then Dewey decided that, they were the logical empiricists were reductionists and the pragmatists were not reductionists. And that was true. And then just to be very concise, really what happened is that the Vienna Circle lost their reductionist tendencies as the years went by, because you can't reduce even all of science to observation statements. Scientific laws and dispositional terms just can't be crammed into that model. So the Vienna Circle in America drifted closer to the pragmatists. And you have people like Philip Frank saying in the 1950s, look, we were always pragmatists. This is what we were always on about. And was, well, not quite, but it's good that you are now.
Yeah, fascinating issue. So the question here for you, Dave, how would you assess Schlick's place in the reception and legacy of the Circle, given his continuous and unbalanced debates with Neurath and his extreme and spiritual relation to Wittgenstein? And there's a follow-up saying, do you think that some other members of the Circle, like Hahn and Neurath and Frank, became disappointed by Schlick's leadership of the Circle and the focus on Wittgenstein?
Neurath definitely fell out with Schlick for lots of reasons, some of which we've discussed: different politics, different approach to what the Circle should be doing. And Schlick actually didn't rate Neurath as a philosopher, and that became clear when he wouldn't include Neurath in one of the book series of the Circle. How do I rate Schlick's legacy? Well, I don't know how important he was as a philosopher, but he was the conductor. He was the conductor of the group. He was the conductor of the orchestra, and there would have been no orchestra without the conductor. So he was absolutely vital to the group. He was vital to keep these egos in check. He was there at the right time to bring all these people together. They were often presented as a homogenous group. They had very different ideas on lots of things. You know, even about mathematics, for example, where Gödel is a Platonist and a completely different approach to the foundations of mathematics to all the others. Schlick was able to keep all these people together. So his legacy is the legacy of the conductor, basically. And without him, we wouldn't have the Circle.
I like this idea that contributions to philosophy don't have to take the form of lone feats of genius, but can be these conductor roles. I mean, maybe I'm contributing to philosophy right now by bringing together this fantastic circle of panelists. So here's a question for you, Cheryl. Is there an irony that the statement, if it can't be verified, it has no value, is itself not verifiable? I suppose more than an irony, a serious problem for the whole program.
It's a serious problem for the whole program. And, as I said, there's a whole cluster of statements that aren't verifiable in that initial way that the Circle and Wittgenstein and the Tractatus required. And, we've been talking about the Vienna Circle at a very particular time, really, kind of between the wars. And they started to address these really serious problems within their position. And I think that's why they drifted closer to American pragmatism, because the American pragmatists never said anything like, well, occasionally it did, but their considered judgment wasn't that a meaningful statement has to bottom out in, like physical experience. And so, they could have a theory of value where you have to take experience seriously, but experience is the experience that you and I have of, say, injustice. Whereas that didn't hold, that was not on for the early Vienna Circle, right? So they became less strict, more liberal, after the Second World War. But yes, for sure, their initial position had all sorts of problems like the one the questioner raises.
And a question for you, David. What about biology in the Circle? Seems biology was ignored or downplayed, even though there was an important institute for experimental biology in Vienna.
Yes, there are a few gaps. Biology is one of them. There's a strange inclusion. So you would expect biology to be much more have a much more center role than it does. One of the things that's intriguing about the Circle is how, despite their attitude to politics and to ethics, and this is something we haven't discussed, how nonetheless they are so political and have strong ethical views. This is a group of people who have determined that ethical statements and normative statements of all kinds, aesthetic statements, are meaningless because they are neither true by definition, nor can you verify them, nor can you test whether they are true in the real world. And yet they were very politically engaged people. So there were some strange gaps. Biology is one of them. There isn't much talk of biology in the Circle. And then there are these strange additions, which they don't necessarily talk about in Circle meetings, but some of them are very political. We talked about Neurath, Carnap as well. They have a strong political program. And the question is, well, how on earth do you verify that with the verification principle? And that's something that they all struggle with, and the role of ethics is something that is talked about. In what way can you meaningfully say this is something you ought to do? We ought to have this program for the city of Vienna. How does that make sense, given that normative statements are meaningless?
Thanks. We've got time for one more question, which I'm going to put to all of you and hopefully get quick answers from all of you. Are there any equivalent groups to the Vienna or Berlin circles today, in particular with respect to the idea that philosophy or philosophy of science is a collaborative project rather than a lone wolf genius discipline? Maria, Carla?
Well, there are a number of centers where philosophy of science is done in this or this other way. For instance, there is this project of formal epistemology, which I regard as as having catch up with the legacy of 𝗘𝗱𝗺. There is a big center in Munich for that, but there are also other centers. I think that philosophy of science today, in certain areas, because now today there is no philosophy of science in itself. There are several philosophies of sciences, philosophy of physics, philosophy of medicine, philosophy of
field is fragmented,
and so on and so forth. And it is true that in certain of these areas, philosophy of science is not done by a single person, but by groups of people, clusters of people. So it depends really on what field we are talking about.
Yeah. What do you think, Cheryl?
No, I think where Carla is right that formal epistemology is kind of the legacy of the Vienna Circle, and my sense is that they think of themselves as engaging in a kind of a group project, to make progress.
What do you think, Dave?
No, there's nothing like the Vienna Circle. It arose in a particular time and a place with a particular political and social background and context, and it would be almost impossible to reproduce today.
Well, in that sense, I agree completely. Yeah, taken in that sense, I agree.
Yeah, so nothing quite like it. Still, I wonder if one of the main contributions it's made to the philosophy is this idea that philosophy can be a collaborative discipline. It can resemble science in being the sort of thing that is done by teams, lab-like groups. If that's right, that's a very important idea, I think, that I much prefer to the lone genius coming out with little aphorisms model of philosophy.
Yes, but they weren't the only ones who had this idea, right? I mean, the whole of Europe was covered in these little circles with, mathematicians and then also the American pragmatists, thought that, inquiry was everything, and that philosophers were engaged in a community-wide inquiry. So it was a time in which this idea flourished.
Yeah. Okay, that's all we've got time for. Thanks very much to all of you who attended. Thanks very much for your questions. And of course, thank you to our panelists, Dave Edmonds, Cheryl Misak, and Maria Carla Galavotti for fantastic discussion and fantastic answers to those questions. Thanks very much.
Thank you.